So today, I would like to talk about something that was brought up in Dr. Ruth Cherry's wonderful workshop yesterday. She talked about thriving with chronic illness. And it was a wonderful, wonderful workshop. She plans to continue it on a once-a-month basis to talk about the power of meditation, to talk about allowing ourselves to feel good about who we are, even when things are not necessarily going our way. One of the things that she talked about yesterday was, what she mentioned yesterday was the inner critic, the archetype of the inner critic that lives within all of us. What is an archetype? It's a pattern, a universal pattern for living. Everyone has an inner critic, just the way everyone has an inner child, or everyone has a wise sage, a warrior, an orphan. We each share these concepts, which become an aspect of our personality. The inner critic is such an aspect of our personality. The inner critic is named that, and has been named other things throughout the years, because it criticizes. Also, I just want to parenthetically add that one of the great fallacies of human nature is that each of us thinks when we say I, that we're talking about one entity. I am me. I am I. This is what I do. This is how I react. But one of the things that can help us immeasurably in recognizing our spiritual nature and honoring the fact that we are learning to be human is to understand that at any given time, various aspects of our human nature can come to the mouth and say, yes, that's what I think, that's what I feel. I. They all call themselves I. Let me share with you an ancient Sufi parable it's called the parable of the householder. It seems that in ancient days, there was a master of the house, and he was going away on vacation. He told the servants that were there to keep watch on the house and make sure that everything was going smoothly, and that there would be a reward for them when he returned home. Well, the moment the master left, the servants all got drunk. And they had a big party. And when the party was in full swing, someone knocked at the door. And the servant closest to the door opened it and said, "Yes, I'm the master. How can I help you?" So whatever was coming from that drunk servant at the time, the person at the door thought that that was the master. That was who the master was. So the important lesson that we get from this parable of the householder is that there is a center of our being, a center of gravity, a place where the divine I am resides. That transcends all aspects of personality. And that divine I am is the master of the house. And when we forget that, then any one of these other archetypes, particularly the inner critic, can come forth and say, this is who I am. This is what I am. This is what I believe. So if that makes sense, we need to accept the fact that we have many, many different aspects to our own personality, many different archetypes that can call themselves I at any given time. Now, the inner critic is a special archetype, and it's compiled of all of the criticisms that not only we have ever heard growing up, but that anyone has ever heard. growing up. We understand that when we're babies, when we're toddlers, we're told a lot of things, mostly starting with the word no. No, that's not safe. No, don't do this. No, don't do that. We begin to accumulate those messages, not only the ones that we hear, but the ones that anyone has ever heard, because there is a universal collective consciousness, and we feel things and know things on a gut level that we really didn't know we knew. So not only do those no messages come and make an impression on our consciousness, but they also connect with all of the other no's that anyone has ever heard, because there is one mind, one universal omnipresent mind in which each of us has consciousness. Therefore, we need to recognize that what we think, what we feel, is pretty much what everybody thinks and feels in varying degrees. And what we think and feel does have an effect on others. So we get all of these no messages, no, not safe, not wise, and we begin to understand at a very basic rudimentary level that our impulses are not to be trusted. Now, this is very appropriate for a 2 or 3-year-old, which is why they don't issue driver's licenses to those children. No, it is a fact that, and one can think this through and understand that, no, you're not going to trust a 2 or 3-year-old with the kitchen knife, with an electric appliance in the bathtub or any of those things, because the child doesn't have the accumulated wisdom yet to make those decisions. However, as children, we do hear those no messages, and we do hear those "you're not capable of making a decision" messages, and we carry them through. We carry them through our lives. Who will protect us, we say, as we move on through the years? Who will protect me from myself? The archetype of the inner critic says, I will. I've always told you you didn't have good judgment, and I will continue to do that. Now, you come to the conclusion, well, the inner critic should know that I've grown up. The inner critic should know that I don't need protection, that I'm not necessarily in danger, that everything I do is not always wrong. But the critic has its place. It's called the critic. It looks like the critic. It sounds like the critic. It feels like the critic. The critic criticizes, just as our inner child needs the love of a reassuring parent, just as the wise sage always comes out with wise and wonderful and powerful rules to live by, or laws to understand, or ways to experience a better life. This cast of characters that inhabit the spectrum of our consciousness, they are true to their names. Now, obviously, these names have been given for a very long time by wise and knowing philosophers and psychologists, because they've observed human nature for many, many years, and they see that these are the aspects that dominate our human mind. So ideally, when we would want to be wise and wonderful, we would be able to call on the wise archetype within us. We would be able to understand that that was an aspect of our own consciousness, that we didn't need to get that feeling from anyone else. We could get the feeling of being wise and being centered by calling it forth in our consciousness. A lot of us don't remember that. We look out here and we look out there. No, I don't have the power. I don't have the strength. I can't be a leader. I can't do this. I don't know how to approach this. But the truth is, and one of the reasons why Unity and the New Thought movement exists, is to remind us to awaken to the archetypes within us, to be able to handle the ones that are over-expressing and to call forth the ones that are under-expressing. Yes, we do have what it takes. We might not be as well acquainted with that warrior, that wise one, that expression of pure love as we are with the critic. Now, let me tell you something about the critic. But that doesn't mean they're not there. It's the end of that sentence. Let me tell you something about the critic. The critic seems to want to take center stage. Well, has to take center stage in our consciousness, because we wouldn't have survived without all of those no's. No, traffic. No, this. No, that. I tried really hard as I was raising Matthew, knowing all this information. I thought, well, let me try the great experiment. And instead of giving him all these no statements, I started explaining the rationale behind not going out in traffic. Well, quickly I abandoned that because he was like 2 years old, you know, and the rationale behind not going out in traffic was totally inappropriate, bored him to death. It was just not, it's not the way it can be most effective. Something that I think did work was we had a stop and go game. So it wasn't, no, it was, we get to a corner and let's hear the word stop. Yay, we stopped, the light was red. Okay, and then the light turns green and Matthew would kind of, you know, get ready for that and go. So it was stop and go. It wasn't, oh my God, you're going to get killed because you can't think for yourself. It wasn't that. But like any archetype, it lives with or without negative input. It lives. It just lives. Why would something in our own consciousness be against us? What would be the point of that? Well, I will address that as soon as we hear our number from the wonderful Brett Mitchell and my incredibly talented son, Matthew J. Evans.
And a time for every purpose under heaven. A time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to reap, a time to kill, a time to heal, a time to laugh, a time to weep. To everything, turn, turn, turn. There is a season, turn, 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 and a time for every purpose under heaven. A time to build up and a time to break down, a time to dance, a time to mourn, a time to cast away stones, a time to gather stones together. To everything, turn, turn, turn. There is a season, turn, 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 and a time for every purpose under heaven. A time of love and a time of hate, a time of war and a time of peace, a time you may embrace, a time to refrain. There is a season, turn, 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 and a time for every purpose under heaven. soul. A time to love, a time to hate, a time for peace. I know it's not too late. To everything, turn, turn, turn. There is a season, turn, 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 and a time for every purpose under heaven.
That was beautiful. That was really beautiful. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Brett. So, yes, to everything there's a season, which in this context to me means that every aspect of our consciousness is necessary and important in some way. Now, the question that I asked before the numbers started was, why would the critic be out there so loudly and fiercely and want to hurt us? Well, it wouldn't. It wouldn't want to hurt us. Why? Because there is one presence and one power, the power of good, the power of life, the power of love. The critic is born out of a facet of that love. The critic's job is not to kill us with criticism. It's to protect us from what we're not mature enough to know ourselves. So you hear messages from the critic like, what makes you think you can succeed at that? Oh my God, what an effort you're making. Very few people succeed at that. That's really a tough one. Or why did you try to do that? Why did you go for it? You knew that it was too hard. You knew that you were in danger. You knew that you weren't going to make it. And we have to live with that. That's one of the servants that comes to the door, drunk and unbridled because the master's away. Well, we got to call the master back home. The master, the divine I am within us, is the one that can identify the critic. Now, years ago, I went through a particularly heinous experience. It was probably the best way I could learn, but it was really, really, really challenging, quite debilitating. The critic was out in a rage, furious with me that I dared to take the job at Unity of San Luis Obispo. By the way, I've been here 25 years in April. But at that time, we were going through a great change. New minister coming in, old minister leaving. Nobody wanted him to leave, and it was, I became the wicked stepmother, but because I wasn't familiar with the archetypes, I wasn't able to use my observer, which is another archetype, to discern that that was what was happening. My critic said, who did you ever think you were to go ahead and take this job? I mean, who could ever be loved? Why did you think you could be loved the way he could? What makes you think you have anything to say that will keep the people here that missed him? What made you think you were so special that you could turn it around? I told you you were going to suffer. This was a really bad idea. Deal with it. It was hideous. Because I did not have, you see, being a perfectionist by nature, and when I say perfectionist, what I mean by that is each of us is perfect by nature. I love myself the way I am. Capital I, capital A, capital M. I love myself the way I am. The lyric goes on to say I still need to grow and there's nothing I need to change. But the fact is that there are things we need to call forth and other things that we need to hold at bay. We're the executive directors of our consciousness, and we have the ability to say at any given moment, wow, this critic is really bashing me. But why would the critic bash me, especially when I feel like I'm down? Well, why? Why would that happen? Why did it ever happen? The critic is trying to save us from despair, from failure. The critic is trying to say, don't try it. It's too hard. I don't want you to fail. I don't want you to. Critic has become neurotic in its efforts to save us from embarrassment and failure. Can we change the critic? Can we reason with the critic? No, the critic's the critic. The plumber's the plumber. The architect is the architect. It is what it is. One time I was involved, and see the problem with that period of time, I know many ministers go through something similar. This was somewhat relentless, and it lasted for quite a long time. But then again, it had to, because I had to learn. They had to learn. We all had to learn. And you don't learn out of a book. You don't learn in hypothetical statements. You learn by experience. And this experience was, can I find the love inside of me? Can I find the honor and dignity? Can I remember the talent, the spiritual gifts inside of me in the face of what I always thought was my worst fear coming true? Can I do that? For quite a while, I wasn't really sure. It was so devastating. You see, the perfect me becomes perfectionistic, when it interprets the idea of perfection in a not wise or loving way. The perfectionist in me said, I have to be perfect. I have to make everyone say, oh, thank God this happened. We are so blessed. My life is enriched because of what you say. I've learned so much. You know, all of the things that one dreams of, when one is using the ego, which is another archetype, to do the dreaming. Anything less than that looked like a failure to me. And when I started to doubt myself, the critic was up there saying, of course you doubt yourself. Who told you to do that to begin with? Who said you could carry that on? Does anybody recognize that voice? Yeah, of course you do. We all do. Don't ever think you're alone in this. Seriously, it's not true. So it was a sink or swim situation. And all these years later, I can look back and understand what I've learned from this. One night in particular, that I shared a bit of yesterday, was the time that I was so inundated with an onslaught, a barrage of criticism. Now, bear in mind that the inner critic is not the only one that criticizes. I mean, there are people out there that will help to prove that what we're thinking inside of ourselves is true. So I had people all around me calling me all hours of the day or night and, telling me what I did wrong. And at one point, I remember it was really an important time because I was sitting at this on the floor on the side of my bed, just reeling from this onslaught. And I said, And the inner critic was saying, oh, listen, what the outer critic was telling me on the phone, the inner critic was saying, oh, that is true, and more. I mean, not only were you terrible at that, but I can think of other times. Remember the first grade? Remember the fifth grade? Yes, of course I do. But I said to myself, to the critic, I said, is there anything I can ever do to please you? And the voice said, no, I'm the critic. This is my job. I mean, the only thing that was missing was nothing personal here. Of course it was, but that is the job of the critic. I woke up. Not that anything was happier after that, but I woke up to realize that, number one, the standards I had set for myself were unreasonable. They were the perfectionist speaking. The perfectionist says, you know, in order for you to prove your worth, you better walk on water. No, literally, you better walk on water. You know, perfectionist has very high standards. But the critic is there to tell us not to try something that stupid again because we'll fail. It doesn't hate us. It's not out to get us. It's out to protect us, as it always was. So, I would like to suggest, as I did in the book I co-authored in 2001 called Spirituality and Self-Esteem, I would suggest an ode to the critic. ODE is an acronym. And the first letter stands for observe. Now, many people have tried to tame their critic, try to kill their critic, try to strangle their critic, try to ignore their critic, try to keep the critic at a distance, keep it in a cage, tame it. The internet is full of ways to get rid of your critic. And believe me, I've tried them all, as I'm sure you've tried a number of ways yourself. Well, it doesn't work. And why doesn't it work? Because we need the critic sometimes for some things. Observe that this is the critic. You can ask, is this the critic talking? I mean, she or he will be happy to say, yes, it is. I'm here to serve. I'm here to protect. Don't argue with the critic. The critic has thousands and thousands of years of experience. You will not win an argument from. You will not be able to reason with the critic. The critic is emotionally based and is there to protect you. That's its job. That's what it's going to do. Don't reason with it. Observe it. Watch how it works. One of the things that the critic does is it puts you in a no-win situation. You never have a choice with the critic. You failed or you're going to fail. Those are the only two messages it has. Listen, observe with your rational mind how that critic behaves. It holds itself up as the Lord of your being, as the one that's always right, as the one that has knowledge that you couldn't possibly have because it still thinks you're 2 years old and you need help knowing when to cross the street. You don't argue with a 2-year-old. You don't try to fight or keep down the critic because it will throw a tantrum. It will throw a tantrum. You're not listening to me? Oh, you think you're going to carry this off by yourself? Well, let me tell you, 4 hours later, it's still going. You should have done, you didn't do, if you were better, if you were this, if you were that. Enough. But as you observe, you begin to see the patterns, you begin to understand how it works. So one of the things is really important to remember. that the inner critic is not the person, that the aspect of consciousness from which we will receive constructive feedback. Although the inner critic can hit the nail on the head sometime, that is not the place you go to evaluate your state of mind or your state of the consciousness. No, it's not. There is a reasonable aspect of consciousness that's able to objectively critique and see where improvement needs to be made. Like the most wonderful teacher, the critic can say, here's where it would have been wise, or in the future would be wise, to turn a corner. This would be the place where you might not behave this way because these would be the consequences. Here's a way you can refine and enhance. That is not something you're going to get from the critic. Critic is in survival mode, protection mode, and it's not a rational thinker. So when you observe the critic, then you are able to look at it and distance yourself as much as possible from the situation. That's the O, observe. D, for discern, is once you are able to evaluate the situation, you can recognize and understand what it's doing and why it's doing it. That doesn't mean you let it have free rein in your consciousness. You discern that that might not be the best way for me to open myself up to the living spirit of truth. The critic is overstepping. The critic has the microphone all the time. The critic is not sharing the truth. The critic is trying to protect. It's an emotional and a spontaneous reaction from an aspect of our consciousness that still sees ourselves as vulnerable and not capable. So we discern, we evaluate, we judge, but not condemn. That this critic, well, you can't get rid of the critic. You don't want to get rid of the critic, but you can redirect the critic. This you do with the rational, discerning part of mind. You redirect the critic to a place where they can do good, they can help. When I was able to recognize the critic and what it was really good at, I use her when my income tax is being done or to decide any business agreements. That's where she's really good because she will find the mistakes. And that's what we're looking for. Proofreading my own work, anybody else's work, that critic can spot errors that hadn't even showed up. That critic can spot an error on the next page that I haven't even read yet because it's that good at finding mistakes. So let the critic be, because there's no way we're ever going to get rid of it. It will fight back, and we do not want another war in our own consciousness. Finally, the E for ode is embrace. Embrace your inner critic. Don't try to get rid of it. Understand it, love it, redirect it, manage it. But don't try to slap it in the face and get rid of it. It will turn you into mashed potatoes, I promise. Anyway, bottom line, the end of the story. Not really the end of the story, but the end of that part of the story, I became much more knowledgeable as a result of that experience, much more compassionate as a result of that experience. When I say compassion, I mean linking myself with all people around the globe who suffer because of wars and conflict within their own consciousness. It prompted me to want to delve much more deeply into the Gandhi philosophy of nonviolence, particularly the aspect of passive violence that plagues those of us who don't go around hitting people as a course of getting in touch with their anger. No, the passive violence can enervate us, can exhaust us, can cause us harm if we don't embrace it. Embrace it, does that mean approve of it? Well, I mean, she is my inner critic, whom I've called Aunt Rose. This has nothing to do with anybody named Rose. She has been so diligent for me on my taxes. She was very strong when she helped us move from our old location to this one. She was there with the contractors. Oh, what about this? What about that? What about this? What about that? I count on her for those things. Laundry, getting out stains, impeccable. I'm telling you, there's nothing like the inner critic to look at a wardrobe or at any kind of grooming and see, you know, what's working and what isn't. Amazing capabilities she has, or he. But not to be our conscience, not to be our guide. The critic will put us in a no-win situation, and that is never true in spirit. Observe, discern, embrace. The inner critic will keep it at bay. You have an opportunity to call forth all of the other archetypes that will help you embrace, protect, direct, without having to listen to that kind of verbal abuse. Okay?